Good afternoon all, and thank you for the presentation. It is my pleasure to be here. I would like to thank the society and especially the special committee that nominated us to be here this afternoon, and also its council. I would like to thank the Research Council in... Sorry, have you lost it? Well, it's written over there, so I'm not worried, but you can listen. Okay. So I would like to also to thank the Research Council in Portugal, without which a lot of research would not have been done, namely the research I've been doing for several years now. Also this project that is starting on the History Lab for Sustainable Urban Mobilities, IBIC Lab on Lisbon, it's financed through this foundation, and I would like to thank its team. We just completed the team hiring someone from Brazil who is coming to Lisbon hopefully this month. And also I would like to thank my research center, the Inter-University Center for the History of Science and Technology in Lisbon, and my university, the Nova University of Lisbon, for the institutional support and also for the support of the colleagues. Some of them are here and I'm very glad that they are. So this is the summary of the presentation. I'm going to talk about transport and mobility history, their connection to history of science and technology, and the connection to these two current topics, which is something that we have been discussing from the beginning of the conference, actually. So it is a common concern. Then I'm going to make a plea for the mobilization of history of science and technology, namely by reaching other audiences, and in specific, I'm going to propose history labs. And then I will conclude. So mobility as circulation has been a key topic in the historiography of science, as you all know, and technology, namely the circulation of objects, people, and practices, and their role in the construction of knowledge or ignorance, identities and spaces. It has been questioned what circulates and why, and whether what circulates is transformed or not and produces knowledge in the process of circulation itself, and what contributes to the relationship between the local and the global. In a recent appraisal, I don't know if you can see the name of the articles there. Is it readable? Okay. In a recent appraisal by Ana Simões and Maria Paula Diogo, who are here, on the historiography of sciences in Europe, published by Centauros since it became the official journal of the society since 2007, they underline the contribution made by the STEP network, the Science and Technology in the European Periphery, emphasizing key concepts that deconstruct the essentialized notion of European science. And I quote, STEP showed how diversity and plurality have shaped the sciences in Europe, and at the same time providing a framework to move from the local to the global. And they specifically, one of the concepts that they bring, that they underlined, is the concept of creative circulation, which treats circulation, and I'm quoting again, not as knowledge in motion, but as knowledge in the making. And this is related to another article that is mentioned there. This is the article about moving localities, authored by Pedro Raposo, Ana Simões, Manolis Patiniotis, and José Ramon Bertomeu. Apologies. So what I'm bringing this creative circulation, the STEP network, and Pedro Raposo in particular because in 2013, the year I was finishing my PhD, I was invited by Pedro to participate in a workshop that he was organizing. Actually, Ana Simões was a commentator on my paper, Mobility and Circulation Perspectives in the History of Science and Technology, and this was published in Portuguese later. And I told him, well, the mobility you are talking about in that workshop is not the mobility I'm dealing with. And so this is why I brought this kind of introduction to let you know what kind of mobility I'm dealing with in this lecture. But still, they wanted plural approaches, so I participated in the workshop, and we had a fruitful discussion. Actually, Pedro Raposo in this book, in this chapter, he says something like the whole science of technology is to a greater or less extent a history of circulation. And other contributors such as Inês Gomes and Isabel Zilhão also second James Seckard knowledge in transit, of science also being a process of communication, and communication is also part of mobility. So just to make a parenthesis here, I also deal with this notion of circulation in my work, of course, circulation of experts, expertise, artifacts, standards, socio-technical systems for appropriation and circulation have been major key research topics in my research center in Lisbon, as well as in European-based research networks, such as the Tensions of Europe, which has already been mentioned, research network mainly of historians of technology, and the STEP network. So still, the topic of mobility I am addressing here reflects an interest on moving itself, of how does mobility takes place, of this question of the how, and on the meaning constructing in the movement. So it is more about geographical mobility and not the sociological concept of social mobility, although both can be related because mobility has also been theorized as capital by the sociologist Vincent Kaufman. So, and I'm going now to use a we. We have just collectively experienced this COVID pandemic and other current crisis experience that show how mobility and immobility issues, how they are governed, which social technical systems they are based in, both in terms of infrastructure and regulation in different geographical scales, are important to our daily lives, both individually and socially. And the we I've used in the beginning of this sentence is not, as we know, an homogeneous entity. Not surprisingly, the history of epidemics recently emphasized in the Journal Centauro's spotlight issue, if looked through the lenses of mobility, shows that the measures taken to solve and to define them are social negotiations in which different types of expertise take part, and in which mobility and immobility, again, are key issues. Examples can be found in the promulgation of quarantines, lockdowns, and even in the discussion of the end of the pandemic, of an epidemic, or ideas on urbanism as an answer to prevention epidemics by 19th century hygienist movements in European cities. This also has to do with mobility, regulating mobility and immobility. Before and during COVID, other public discussions and policy measures took place that had mobility as a central aspect, namely intersectional debates or the construction of pop-up bicycle lanes. This is one of the most polemic bicycle lanes in Lisbon right now. As part of the discussion of public safe spaces, the right to the city, on reducing the dependence on private automobility, and also with issues concerning other scales as migration or environmental crisis. The measures taken to counteract the COVID pandemic, with planes not getting off the ground, forced us all to think of alternative ways of substituting in-person meetings for other forms of communication. After an online conference in 2020, due to the pandemic, this conference now of this society takes place in physical presence. How are you feeling from being here together in person? How does this contribute to the sharing and making of knowledge on the history of science, technology, and medicine. Meetings in presence are highly valued by many scholars who rely heavily on air travel, even in situations in which other modes of mobility could be considered. The strong reliance of the academic community on air travel, and I traveled by plane, I must say, was discussed in a session held at the TTUM, which stands for the International Association for the History of Traffic, Transport and Mobility, in the conference held in Paris in October 2019, just a few months before the COVID pandemic. It raised issues on the social and environmental impacts and inequalities of the mobility habits and dependence of this community on flying. The analysis of the survey to this community was published by the French historian Arnaud Passalacqua, who contested, and I quote, "the doctrine that research excellence is achieved through increased travel." Is this clear? The doctrine that research excellence is achieved through increased travel, claiming that, and I quote again, "a reduction in air travel would not necessarily harm the quality of the science itself." So I think we should consider this as a community in our future traveling habits. Sociologist and historian Mimi Scheller one of the promoters of the influential new mobilities paradigm, which contributed to the start of a new field in mobility studies, proposed a way to tackle together several scales in which mobility questions related to power, inequality, and justice bring together previous versions of her own work and other scholars, as well as the work of activists. To do so, she proposes the following concept of mobility justice. A part of it is written over there. Mobility justice is an overarching concept for thinking about power and inequality, how power and inequality inform the governance and control of movement, shaping the patterns of unequal mobility and immobility in the circulation of people, resources, and information. And then I will continue. We can think about mobility justice occurring at different scales. From the micro level, so from the level of the body, from the micro level embodied interpersonal relations, so here we have the intersectional issues, to meso level issues of urban transportation justice and the right to the city, to macro level transnational relations of travel and borders, and ultimately resources, flows, and energy circulation. End of quote. Mimi Scheller acknowledges the normative dimensions, and this is important, in mobility research. It engages not only, and I'm quoting again, in critical analysis of historical and existing mobility systems, but also models future transitions that might help us to bring about alternative cultures of mobility. So all these issues are current concerns with mobility questions, which have been studied by social scientists such as sociologists, geographers, anthropologists, who have made a plea for the need to understand historically this phenomena. For instance, in terms of, and I'm quoting, colonial histories, global geographies, and the global impacts of neoliberalism, end of quote. So historians of technology have been in the forefront in producing work on mobility topics, such as on socio-technical systems, the making and circulation of knowledge and ignorance, and its spatial co-shaping, the role of experts, lay experts, mediators, activists, users, and the technoscientific and cultural politics of mobility. The historians of technology are well equipped to answer the questions that the historiography of mobility and transport has been raising. namely to grasp the tensions of who has access and control of mobilities and the frictions of what needs to be immobile, so maybe a few can be mobile. And the disciplining process that is done through this, and in discipline, well, I'll discuss it later, maybe in the discussion. So now I'm going to talk about the historiography from the past 20 years in mobility and transport and mobility histories. And so as an increased interest in the mobility history related issues, in 2003, the T2M Association was created through the joint efforts of different research groups, including the Mobility History Group of the Tensions of Europe Research Network. The Tensions of Europe Research Network of mostly historians of technology had been founded in 1999, as well as the STEP network. And it had T2M as the historian Heismom as its first president. In the same year, Heismom published the widely quoted article, "What kind of transport history did we get?" in which he assessed 50 years of the Journal of Transport History articles. And he made a plea for the history of a transport as a whole, or an integrated transport history that emphasized the role of technology, both on the user and the producer side, and emphasize also transnational and transmodal histories. He made an explicit plea for a mobility turn, for a mobility history. This new approach meant a semantic change, including the discussion of whether the term transport should be replaced by mobility, and was discussed in the following years in the pages of the Journal of Transport History, which became the adopted journal of the association T2M, and in other periodicals that started to be published, such as the T2M yearbook called Mobility in History and the journal Transfers. Also, the article by the historians Colin Deval and George Revel, which raised quite a controversy on the cultural turn, dialogued with this plea. And this has been going on with articles published either in the Journal of Transport History, either also, I forgot to mention this book published by French colleagues, edited by Mathieu Flano and Vincent Guiguenot. Still the issue continues to be debated. Just now, a special issue came out in 2022, in this summer, called, which came out as a result of a call named Building Transport History Ontologies by the editor-in-chief Massimo Moraglio and the associate editors. And this reflects the continuous interest on this discussion between mobility and transport history. And Massimo concludes that from the articles that are part of this special issue, that this cross-interest is focused on the spatial dimensions of transport as well in the politics of mobility. So these lively debates went hand in hand and were influenced by the development of mobility studies, much promoted by the agenda setting of the new mobilities paradigm, and I'm quoting, proposed by the sociologist John Urry and the sociologist and historian Mimi Scheller, and who also co-founded the journal Mobilities, as well as developments in cultural geography, namely by Tim Cresswell, and anthropology. So, and I think I here start to address some things that have already been raised during this day. It has to do with the question of the value of history. Why do we write history? Of the potential lessons, and I'm quoting, for the contemporary concerns. And it is indeed an old issue in the historiography of science, technology, and medicine, and continue with us today, as we see. And we can see also the plea to rethink this over again, such as historians of technology were just to dialogue with the so-called, and I'm quoting, grand challenges. This is a term borrowed from policymakers. And recently in articles such as those included in the Centaur Spotlight that I already mentioned, histories of epidemics in the time of COVID-19. Koen Vermeer, editor-in-chief of Centaurus, reminded us in his editorial on the Spotlight issue, which he also co-edited, that the call for looking for, and I quote, lessons of history has been already present in a 1953 Centaurus special issue, and quite assertively states that the Centaurus Journal as a venue that publishes urgent contributions, reflections on current concerns, and history that is pertinent for policy. So if anyone has any doubts, please read this editorial. This is written there. And its openness to publish individual articles related to current topics. And I am quoting. This is again an example of for how societal groups reach for the value of history in order to grasp its lessons. Another example is the plea made by historians of science and technology, such as, and I'm mentioning again Maria Paula Diogo and Ana Simões, that historians of technology should engage in the discussions on the Anthropocene and help recast contemporary challenges. Mobility is part of these contemporary challenges, as I tried to show in the first part, as identified by new agendas coming out, for instance, from the Tensions of Europe network, and also by the special session of the Journal of Transport History, again, just created, called Mobile Cultures and the Anthropocene. In the article that presents this session, Nathalie Rousseau proposes a new term, kinecine, to add to those proposed by many authors, and in particular, the shock of the Anthropocene by Christophe Bonneuil and Jean-Baptiste Fressot, for, and I quote, mobilizing history and its long-term perspectives, sheds lights on how mobility culture became anchored in our societies and the imprints they left on the earth. And to talk about the current concerns obviously raises the risks of presentism. And virtually all authors that I've mentioned that try to relate historiographical thinking to current concerns raise the question of presentism. And here I'm using Naomi Oresk's article, Why Am I a Presentist?, to argue, to borrow a concept of motivational presentism. And she gives two reasons for that, and this is a quote of her work. So the first has to do with the value of history. And well, I can read part of the quote, but you have it there as well. So I'm just going to read just before the part two. We are afraid that our motivations will spill over into our methods. Sam, just a little bit ago, was talking about the good way of connecting our research to current concerns. So this good way might be this motivational presentism. So, and she goes, Naomi Oreskes goes and says, recognizing motivating elements in the present may actually help us to highlight how present concerns affect how we view the past and perhaps write more nuanced, multidimensional, and self-aware history. The second reason is to actually participate in larger debates, to open ourselves to other potential audiences. And now I'm moving to the third part, to say, how shall we do this? And we, I mean, the community of historians of science and technology and medicine. I'm going to give an example for urban mobility, but I think that this can be thought for other topics as well. So taking seriously connecting current concerns with history of technology and working with the, and I quote, usable past, the British historian Colin Deval made a plea in the Journal of Technology and Culture to mobilize the history of technology for wider audiences, namely through research about the ways in which non-academic audiences engage with the technological past, and particularly in exploring these issues in relation to the history of transport and mobility. One of these possible audiences are policymakers. The Swedish historian Per Lundin also mentions the importance of, and I quote, thinking with history for all informed judicious policymaking. Claims to the connection between insights brought by historical knowledge and present and future policymaking have been made both by historians and policymakers, and to do this namely through history labs. And I'm giving the example of two. They are successful examples. The UK online platform History and Policy, created in the early 2000s, provides a forum in which historians engage with current political issues, including transport. As part of this, in 2014, the historian Colin Deval facilitated the History Lab for Civil Service Learning, posing the overarching question, have we learned from Beeching? Beeching was a report of 1963 that led to the closure of suburban railway lines in the UK. And Colin Deval asked these practitioners discussing whether current framing of railway infrastructure policy was likely to prove more robust in the long term than 50 years ago. Another example over a decade ago was the Dutch Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management that started to promoting the use of history to critically reflect on its projects and premises by bringing together historians and policymakers. The corporate historian at the Dutch Ministry of Infrastructures, Bert Toussaint, asserted from his own experience that, and the quote is there, analyzing the history of decision-making processes, views and opinion and options articulated in the past can broaden the repertoire of solutions for present problems, enlarging frames of reference and stimulating conceptual flexibility, bringing in a social cultural dimension that is often neglected in transport and mobility policies. We can mobilize the history of science, technology, and medicine through history labs, in which historical questions are raised and analyzed with coeval sources presented to a specific non-academic audience in ways that have been pointed out by Colin Deval and also by the research project, The Cultural Politics of Sustainable Urban Mobility, coordinated by Ruth Oldenziel, and its output, the book, the edited volume, The U-Turn to the Future, Sustainable Urban Mobility since 1850. And this was edited by the historians Martin Emanuel, Frank Schipper, and Ruth Oldenziel. So we can build on these and also on other critical contributions that study past alternatives to social technical systems. We can at least do it in three ways. So this seems very programmatic, maybe overly simplified, but is a way of action, of mobilizing our research. The first way, and this is also inspired by the other book that I didn't mention, the Cycling Series book, which is now a book series. but I will talk about it later. So the first way is to demystifying the techno tales. And by techno tales, I mean, and I'm quoting, the stories that people use to justify choices about mobility, and more particularly with the technological aspects of such stories, which often include narratives about the past. So in the U-turn book, this corresponds to explain the cultural politics of successfully selling unsustainable mobility in the city through automobility, through the promotion of private automobility, the private use of the car. The second is uncovering the less known alternatives in the past. So in the U-turn book, this is described as painting an inclusive picture of the mobile past, reconstructing those urban mobilities that have left few historical traces and are a result forgotten in the histories of urban mobility. And I specifically, if you're interested in this, to look at the chapters by Tina and Colin Pulley in this book. And one should look, and I had here, one should look also alternatives of technologies in use, to use the David Edgerton's proposal, and also of failed technologies. And a fruitful way to study the alternative technologies in the past is to look into the resistance to more prominent technologies and how resistant to technology has contributed itself to the social construction of technology, as João Valentines Alvarez has proposed. The third way is identifying path dependencies, enabling the discussion of how persistent remnants of the past provide barriers and opportunities to transition towards more sustainable urban mobility. So if we identify alternatives in the past, which we don't know, we are better equipped to think alternatives in the future that we cannot now imagine because we don't have access to those stories in the past. To mention briefly the project that I'm starting now, it's an exploratory project, and it embraces this research agenda that aims mobilizing history to foster future sustainable urban mobilities by making accessible a usable past, which has been promoted, amongst others, by two leading historians who are consultants of the project, Colin Duval and Ruth Oldenziel. So it aims mobilizing history for academic and non-academic audiences to engage them in historical thinking for identifying key social technical factors that have shaped how people move and did not move, and how this might suggest ways to intervene in the present to promote more sustainable urban mobilities, namely in cities with low cycling maturity as Lisbon. So we aim at developing interdisciplinary research because we have an interdisciplinary team. In the team, we have people from our research center in Lisbon working on history of technology and mobility and on citizen science, for instance, Cristina Luís, who is here, Hugo Pereira. We have also a geographer from another university that works on active travel and on the integration of land use and transport planning, David Val. We have an economist from another university, Patricia Mel, working on urban and transport economists, and an architect from yet another university, Bernardo Pereira, working on cycling policies. And so we are developing this first interdisciplinary research, and then we will make legible and understandable to non-academic audiences that urban mobility are systems that are historical, social, cultural, and technical constructions, that they are products of negotiations of social norms, power, technical expertise, uses of public spaces, agendas and expectations of diverse social groups, infrastructural path dependencies and regulations. And we will create this history lab with the municipality of Lisbon, activists and users. This is an expected outcome of the book, which is to be part of the Cycling Series book series, to produce a book on Lisbon. And those are 5 exploratory factors that have been identified by the Cycling Series book series, which we are going to question if they served our case. And to conclude, because I think I'm running out of time, there are risks of looking for the usable past, for the lessons of history in our work, which are humbly recognized by those who are trying to make explicit contributions in this direction, namely risks of a misuse of the past. And Sam mentioned an example, for instance, with decontextualized metaphors or direct comparisons of current situations to those of the past. But, and I argue, there are also risks of not doing it, namely making a poor public sphere in which current and pressing problems are being discussed, by not making and translating the historical knowledge reproduced to wider audiences, namely the general public and decision makers. In the introduction to the 2020 Centauro Spotlight issue, which I already mentioned, Erika Charter and Richard McKay stated that, and I quote, "History does not offer a single coherent vision of the past." End of quote. And the research that we are doing today, we historians, can be revised or challenged by historians today or in the future. Nonetheless, they recognized its value, and I'm quoting again, "Knowing the history of something, whether of numbers, narratives, or disease, enables us to see a broader range of trajectories available to us." So again, history provides resources for thinking trajectories. And in his conclusions on the ontologies of contemporary transport history, and having identified 2 different ontologies, the managerial and collaborative, the sociologist Daniel Normark emphasizes the vital role of history and the usable past in order, and I quote, "to inspire, educate, and warn regarding the possibilities and potentials connected to the cosmopolitan choice." And here the cosmopolitan choice he defines as that is created by a multiplicity of worldviews brought by the historical and the sociological analysis. We find here another time the link between alternative pasts, presents, and imagined alternative futures, which trajectories may be more clear to us, for they are thought through with history. History can create resources for this, keeping the multiplicity of worldviews from the past and co-constructing new imagined futures with non-academic stakeholders. So what moves you to research and write history? Each might have a different answer. Here I am claiming that we should mobilize the history of science, technology, and medicine. Thank you.